Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today's event is led by the Mary Hope Center for Reconciliation, which is a center at the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. At the center of our work, we are looking at how transformative change comes into a personal level, how it is experience between people and in forms of government. And our center really focuses on how processes that aim for transformation or reconciliation can be improved by convening leading experts, advancing research, and supporting programs. One of our key areas has been in developing a psychosocial support program that aims to convene leaders of social transformation to co-create learning community, conduct research, and develop training and educational materials that can support leaders and practitioners that are working at the nexus of neuroscience and peace building, mental health, psychosocial support, trauma healing, and transformation. And we believe that when leaders of social transformation are equipped with the knowledge and practice from the nexus of these disciplines, from well-being and peace building, then the work that they lead both within themselves, within their institutions, and within their societies will become more transformative. So today's event, we're so excited, is co-sponsored by Beyond Conflict, Iloa and Toivoa, which means joy and hope in Finnish, and the Paradox Cross-Cultural and Consulting Services organization. And we're excited to hear from an incredible lineup of speakers. Today, we'll be hearing from Colette Rausch, a research professor at MHCR within the George Mason Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School. She is also the executive producer and host of the Think Peace podcast. She has over 20 years of peace-building experience in nearly 24 countries and has formerly worked with the U.S. Institute for Peace. And her current focus is exploring how trauma affects reconciliation, blending her peace-building experiences, training in neurobiology of trauma, and passion for supporting those on the front lines of building peace. We'll also be hearing from Dr. Corey Henderson, who is an associate scholar at the John Mitchell Jr. Program for History, Justice, and Race within the George Mason Carter School. And his research is rooted in social and behavioral sciences, with an emphasis on historical trauma's influence on the health of African Americans. We'll also be hearing from Cherie Bridges Patrick, and Dr. Cherie is a licensed clinical social worker and the owner of Paradox Cross-Cultural Consulting and Training, which is an organization that provides racial justice leadership development, coaching and training, group facilitation and dialogue, and supports the healing of racialized trauma and stress through customized programs. We'll also be hearing from Mike Nikinchuk, who is the program director, or a program director at Beyond Conflict, leading initiatives focused on trauma and violence prevention in the US, Germany, Jordan, and Lebanon. And these initiatives target two major themes, both the link between neuroscience and participation in group violence, as well as mind-body effects of conflict, forced displacement, and violence among youth and adults. And finally, we'll be hearing also from Keti Sarvella, who is a dentist, therapist, and educator, and she's involved in designing and implementing trauma-informed training for professionals, and is currently involved in trauma-informed training for a multidisciplinary working group designed by the Finnish Work Environment Fund for human workers to promote their own well-being. And finally, excited to also introduce more from the MHCR team. Hannah Adamson is our office coordinator, and Cameron Kassar is our communications officer. And they've been working tirelessly to make sure this event is a success. And they'll be working also to gather questions throughout this webinar. So as you hear our discussion today, we hope that you'll send us in your questions and comments to the panelists, and they'll be making sure your questions are captured and can be brought to the discussion at the end. So today's event, we're so excited that you've decided to tune in and join us. We're going to be focusing our conversation with these amazing speakers on understanding the impact of trauma at both individual and societal levels. And we're going to hear some of their insights on the importance of bringing an understanding of the role of trauma in truth-telling, reconciliation, and peace-building efforts, how the impact of trauma comes to individuals and communities involved in these efforts. And we'll hear from their experience and research ways that individual and collective trauma can be manifested, where the lack of trauma awareness can impede effective social transformation work. And then we'll also hear best practices and lessons learned from how to support organizations and governments to become more trauma informed. As MHCR seeks to expand trauma awareness and psychosocial support within peace and reconciliation processes, we hope that this conversation can provide some meaningful insights from different disciplines and fields to those who are currently developing both state and national commissions. MHCR is engaged with a lot of state and local level commissions that are currently in formation in the US as well as internationally. Some addressing racial harm, as well as violence and land rights in Indigenous communities. And there's also growing support currently for a House Concurrent Resolution 19 and Senate Concurrent Resolution 6 that's been proposed by Congresswoman Barbara Lee and Senator Cory Booker, which calls for a National Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Commission in the US. So we hope all of the insights and lessons learned and shared experiences from our speakers today can provide useful insights to those who are currently engaged in planning and implementing these kinds of processes and community-based interventions, as well as any other kind of social transformation work that, that is currently being led. So with that, I'd like to actually hand it over first to Dr. Cherie. So she's going to guide us in a grounding practice before we get into today's conversation, which could be on the heavier side as we are talking about trauma. So Cherie, we'd love to welcome you now to help get us started.
Thank you, Annalisa. I hope that everyone, can hear me okay. I work around race, and when we talk about race, we are talking about trauma. When we're talking about violence, and when we're talking about racial violence, we are talking about racial trauma. And when we're talking about racial trauma, we're talking about shared or collective trauma, and we're talking about everybody. And so the word race invokes a visceral If you'd like to stand for this, I'm going to stay seated because my space is not configured for me to stand. I prefer standing, and this will be an abbreviated version of, I have frozen, it looks like. I have done an abbreviated, I'll be doing an abbreviated version of this practice. But what I'd like us to do is if you're sitting, get comfortable in your chair, feel your feet on the ground or on the floor. And I keep seeing notes that I am going in and out.
I can hear you now.
Okay, so people
it was cutting out at the beginning, but I think it's the connection is better now.
Is it okay now?
Yeah.
Okay, okay. I'm sorry about that. And so just feel your feet on the ground, and I'm going to close my eyes because I can concentrate better when I do that. Feel your feet on the ground. Feel your bottom on your chair, or if you're standing, just feel your feet firmly planted on the ground, on the floor, wherever you are. And if you're able, if you're comfortable, place your hands on your, right underneath your belly button, just hold it there. This is the place of purpose. And so what I'd like us to focus on today is purpose. Our purpose today is to be able to begin to understand the need for us to address trauma and its impact and its influence on peace and reconciliation and truth-telling. And so as we do that, just get an image in your mind, get a feeling, get a sensation, whatever you can that can draw you to the purpose of our conversation, that can allow us to to create the space for us to have this conversation today, this heavy conversation that will allow us to be open to receive what we need to receive, to speak the words we need to speak, to hear the things we need to hear, and to feel what we need to feel for us to have this conversation. Just hold that image, and as you hold that image or that thought, just take 3 slow, deep breaths in and release. And on that last release, just notice, drop from your head into your body and notice what you're feeling. Notice the sensations, your temperature, your tension, the constrictions, the relaxation, whatever you feel in your body, just notice and perhaps ask, what is that trying to tell you? So we'll take 10 seconds of silence. And holding on to that image or that thought, we can return to the shared space.
Thank you so much for opening our time, Dr. Cherie, and so grateful to be able to have this conversation with all of you today. Just before we went live, we were all gathered for a few minutes before we went live to connect with each other, and said I'd like to imagine that there's a fireplace in the middle of our conversation today, and that we could all bring our warm cup of tea or coffee or whatever we would like to be drinking, and just engage in this conversation and learn from the rich experience that each of us and each of you bring to this topic. And so before we really dive in, I would just love if each of you could share with us a little bit of an introduction of who you are and why this topic is important to you. And if you could share for just 3 to 4 minutes, that would be great. And maybe Colette, if you could start us off, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks so much, Annalisa. It's so great to be here today and to see so many people from all over. I love looking at the chat and seeing all of the cities and towns being popped in there. So feel free, everyone who joined us today, to introduce where you're coming from. And also I'd invite everyone over the next hour plus to pull from what Cherie just shared with us and do whatever you want to do to get comfortable, and whatever you need as we go through this discussion. It can be challenging sometimes to sit in front of Zoom. We're all doing that a lot over the past year. So take a break, look away from the screen, grab some water, move your arms, do whatever it is to take care of yourself over the next hour of engagement. So to answer your question, Annalisa, my interest in the nexus of trauma and peace building arose from the years that I spent working in war-affected countries, primarily working at the institutional level, where involved engagement in programs that were designed to strengthen rule of law systems through justice and security reform efforts, as well as transitional justice programs that were designed to address human rights abuses, provide redress for harm done, with the goal of preventing their reoccurrence. And then also my work that focused on supporting dialogue processes that involved reconciliation, brokering peace treaties, bringing people together in dialogue to help bridge divisions. But in these, what I would say, very technical projects and approaches that we're engaged in, it became really clear to me that there was really something else that we were missing. And despite our best efforts, we were really hitting an invisible wall. And the cycles of violence and injustice continued. Divisions amongst groups sometimes deepened. And this really suggested to me that there was something else at play, and there was something that we were missing in our work. And I grew to realize that what was really missing was that human dimension of conflict. When I say the human dimension, what I'm really referring to is the human brain, the nervous system, and how they interact with and are affected by trauma. And my wonderful colleague, Mike Nikonchuk, will speak very articulately and knowledgeably about that dynamic. And we know very generally that trauma can be passed along generations. The combination of our genes, environment, experiences can have a profound impact on health and well-being. And so this very much human dimension of peace building really came front and center for me when I was working in Libya. And it was just after the fall of the authoritarian leader Muammar Gaddafi. And I was working together with my Libyan colleagues who were government officials, lawyers, and members of civil society. And we were working on a number of justice and security sector related reform projects. And I had heard from some of the international donors that were supporting these efforts and other efforts to stabilize Libya and build back a system based upon rule of law and justice, that they were growing frustrated by the lack of quick progress in clamping down on the armed militias that had taken over parts of the country. And the donors were having difficulty understanding why the Libyan government did not do more to address this problem. And there was also a growing frustration that many in Libya and a number of the cities that were particularly hard hit because of the violence, that they were more focused, it was believed, on addressing the wrongs of the past rather than moving on and addressing the criminality that was spreading in the country. And in addition to the reality that institutions and civil society organizations in Libya had really been decimated under decades of dictatorship and had limited access to material resources, there was definitely, as I'd mentioned earlier, a deeper aspect at play. And that was the lived experiences and the day-to-day reality of those with whom I was working. And one official with whom I worked was a civilian who, like many other civilians, found themselves one day a civilian and then the very next day fighting on the front lines of an internal war that they said they were not equipped to fight, but nonetheless had to for their own survival and the survival of their family. Further, there were many that I worked with in civil society who had also been pulled into actively fighting in the war. And after seeing their friends and family members injured and killed, and they themselves deeply affected by their experiences, they felt that they were expected by outsiders to buck it up and move on as if nothing had happened. And they expressed the challenge that they were expected to look to the future and make strategies for rebuilding the country. But that expectation so soon after the war ended, especially when instability and pockets of violence still existed, was just not realistic, they said. And I heard from my Libyan colleagues and friends that it was not uncommon for them to have trouble concentrating, difficulty relaxing, and experiencing challenges in focusing. Further, many in civil society had wanted accountability for the harm they had experienced, and some were arguing for revenge. And many said they were not at a place where they even wanted to come into dialogue and make amends with those who had caused them harm. And it was through many of the colleagues I worked with in Libya and trauma specialists who were working with us that we grew to learn that these responses are absolutely normal reactions to a very abnormal situation they had been thrown in. And these responses are important to understand and navigate when engaging in truth-telling, reconciliation, and peace-building efforts. Trauma in peace-building work is often in the room with us. We bring it ourselves if we are outsiders supporting a process, or we bring it in the room ourselves when we are part of the groups that are part of the reconciliation process. And what we see is the past can be present in these processes. It affects our relationships. It affects our ability to problem solve together. And what was really amazing and got me so passionate about this topic as I saw Libyan colleagues who integrated aspects of trauma awareness that was relevant specifically for their context and their reality into their dialogue sessions. And this made a difference. So it was my experiences in Libya and in other environments that really drew me to learn more about and to better understand the role of trauma in peace-building processes.
Thank you so much for sharing with us, Colette, and looking forward to hearing more of those experiences from you. Next, we'd love to invite Corey to share. If you'd like to tell us more about who you are and why this topic is important to you.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to be here. As a citizen of the United States and a resident in Baltimore, Maryland, I've had an opportunity to travel, and I've had an opportunity to travel around the different cities. And one of the things that I've discovered is that I have a lot in common with everybody. We've all been to a place where we were physically present, but not mentally there. We've laughed at friends. We've laughed with relatives. We've enjoyed ourselves. And then when we got home, we didn't remember what we even talked about. We were at the pool, but we weren't able to splash around and have a good time because we were wounded and couldn't really immerse ourselves in the experience. That's what it was like growing up in Baltimore City. Growing up in Baltimore City during the time of the crack epidemic, many friends, one day you see their mother walking them to school, the next day their mother's out on the corner. And I began to also realize that it wasn't always drugs that was the middle cause. It was the mental health. It was the trauma. It was everybody that does drugs doesn't sell theirself. Everybody that does drugs doesn't go out and commit suicide. Everyone that does drugs wasn't always meant to be a drug addict, but they couldn't always understand how to numb their pain. And growing up, I saw my mother as my enemy and my dad as my hero. And my mother later told me that she was traumatized from watching her father hit her mother. And my dad watched his father hit his mother. And in the process, he said, I never want to treat a woman like that. And my mother said, no man is ever going to treat me like that. So what I decided was she was mean. I didn't like her, and I wanted to be like my dad. So I sought to make money. I sought to be educated. I sought to be like my father so I would get the level of respect. My older brother, my younger brother, we're all successful Black men. We all own businesses. We all have nice homes. We all drive nice cars. But we've had terrible relationships because we all sought to heal our mother through other relationships we had with women. And it doesn't always have to be an intimate relationship. So in the process, I've discovered that it's an influence of trauma that I try to take solutions from the past and solve my present problems with them and get down on myself when I wasn't able to get the result that those who had used those same solutions had. So today I come to you from a perspective of it's a lived experience, it's a phenomenological experience, and it's a grounded theory experience that I, one, had to interview myself, get to know myself, acknowledge myself, live in the field with myself, and then come back with artifacts of truth, healing, and transformation. That's it.
Thank you so much, Corey, for sharing that with us. And also really looking forward to hearing more of your experiences and insights on this topic. Next, would love to hear from Cherie.
I have to say thank you to Corey for that very energetic introduction. I just appreciate so much what you said. I want to first remind us that, so first, my name is Cherie Patrick, and my work is around racism and racial dominance and racial justice. And so when we talk about race, I like to talk about it from the point that it is an experience for all of us. And it is not just a topic, right? It's not a topic. It is people's lived experience. And regardless of what color we have all been racialized, at least here in the United States, where I'm dialing in from. I want to give a little context, and I want to highlight the normalization of violence that we are operating within as we speak. So right now I'm in Atlanta in the aftermath of a murder spree by a white male suspect who was arrested without incident. And so that tells us that there is a capacity to not be violent, even in the belly of violence. I want to touch on the Violence Against Women Act that expired, I believe, 2 years ago, and it is being reintroduced as the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2021. I'm an adult child of complex or developmental trauma, and this is the trauma that starts early and continues throughout one's life, which was and continues to be supported by a national structure that ensures many of its citizens to experience various types of violence and oppression. I would imagine that if we were honest and open to the truth of our shared lives, we would be able to see that none of us has escaped some form of trauma, including racial trauma. A survivor of domestic violence that included forms of torture, I have endeavored to heal the tenacious harm, and most recently have added awareness somatics to my personal and professional practice, which has enhanced my life immensely in multiple ways. My passion for service led me to pursue a second career in clinical social work for the last 15 years, where the majority of my work has addressed some type of trauma, whether it's domestic violence, childhood trauma, adult and developmental trauma. And now my work examines racial dialogue and trauma in the workplace. For a long time as a social worker, I stayed silent for fear of my own emotional safety or for being excluded. And so the topic of race rarely came up, and if it did, it was by me. When it did, the visceral, polarizing, and silent reaction sent clear messages about the danger that had just been invited. Reports of racism to department and agency leaders not only went unacknowledged, they confirmed the practice of what I call image-focused social justice, where racial justice labor and collective development work is grounded in a mindset of checking the box. And for academics and those familiar with the jargon, this is called white liberalism. So with innumerable experiences, both personal and professional, of silencing and shrinking, this set me on a quest to get closer to this phenomenon. So I pursued a PhD in research to explore the ways that workplace discourses between social workers reproduced and maintained racial dominance while espousing social justice. So I want you to journey with me into this quick story in which I seek to reposition the space in which we often enter the work of racial justice. A brief step into history leads to Giatu Brewer, who was one of the first scholars to study the narratives of formerly enslaved peoples. She engaged the work of John Henry Falk, who was a graduate student in the 1930s and 40s, and who had conducted 12 interviews with formerly enslaved peoples. In an interview shortly before his death in 1979, approximately 40 years later, Falk reacted to a time when he was boasting to a local Black man about the different kind of white man that he was, evidenced by his giving Blacks the right to go to school, giving them the right to vote, by giving them the right to go into anything that they qualified for. This obviously and wise liberated Black man, according to Falk, looked at him very sadly and kind of sweetly and condescendingly and said, "You know, you still got the disease. You can't give me the right to be a human. I was born with that right. Now you can keep me from having that right. And if you have all the policemen and you got all the jobs on your side, you can deprive me of it, but you can't give it to me. I was born with it just like you." This sacred gift, a reminder of who we are, offered by this unknown, wise, and liberated Black man, can reposition the vantage point from which we do the work of racial justice. And from this vantage point, then, we do not fight for what is inherently ours. Rather, we fight to dismantle the systems that have been created and are maintained by unyielding ideologies, capitalism, warism, violence, and trauma, from which we all suffer. And so my work around racial justice then is to help understand the ways that intergroup workplace discourses can help identify, name, and heal the harm caused by racial dominance, trauma, and oppression to strengthen social justice efforts.
Thank you so much, Cherie, for sharing that. And so looking forward to hearing more from you. Next, we'll be hearing from Mike.
Thank you, Annalisa. So when Colette first approached me with this topic, the word that stood out to me so clearly was truth, right? So when I read it, I first read it as the role of truth in trauma telling, the role of truth in trauma telling and reconciliation, because it is a very important and deep topic. The truth is very effing complicated for a lot of people living in conflict zones in a lot of places around the world. I myself, the father of the child of a Ukrainian father and Guatemalan mother. My family in Guatemala, they were close personal friends of Rios Montt, who was tried for genocide. and also were at one point in the history of their family, my grandfather was a close friend of Che Guevara, who dated my great aunt. So the truth of an individual is very complicated and messy and traces through complex lines of division, of antagonism, of perpetration, and of victimhood, and of re-victimization. And when I was reading this topic, I was thinking of how complex truth-telling is in the process of reconciliation within the self and within entire communities, and between communities and the broader nation of what we know those to be. When I think of the story of my mother, when I was 19 years old, I ended up working with a group of ex-combatants from the war in Guatemala. And those combatants who I was working with were the very same men from the same unit who kidnapped and tortured her father, my grandfather. And that process of reconciling who her son had become, the traitor that her son was acting as in a moment that was resurfacing all of her trauma, I became a lived trigger for my mother every day of her life for a significant amount of time as I was doing my work. Yet for me, the truth of the conflict in Guatemala was deeply complex. So what we're talking about here is that the truth of what happened to me, to my people, to my community, whichever vantage point you're sitting at in Black America, as a Latin American, as a Syrian refugee here in Jordan, where I'm calling from, whatever the vantage point of your trauma has been, the truth, the very thing which you know can set you free from the chains and the monsters that haunt you at multiple times in your day and in your life and in how you treat others, that thing which is your liberator is also your captor. Because those truths that people want to tell, that want to share, are the very same truths and narratives that reinforce and reify the damaging effects of trauma in the brain, in the body, and in interpersonal relationships. So truth, that thing which can be a liberator, is so often a captor. And I think of one of my closest friends who he can never tell his truth to a therapist because his truth is too shameful for him. There's too much going on inside of him. To simply utter those words would be to open up a world of pain that he is not ready to open up. Yet at the same time, that is the narrative that reinforces the oppression and the prison that he creates in his mind, in his body, in his cells, in his muscles for himself. So as we think about truth, we have to think of it as a double-edged sword, as the thing which will set us free, and the truth will set us free is either Gloria Steinem or the Gospel of John, wherever you read it first, right? So the truth definitely will set you free, but the truth is often a very, very complex liberator that tears apart societies before it can set anyone free.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Mike. Next, we'll hear from Katie.
Thank you. My name is Kati Sarvela. As a European dentist, as a first profession, I have a little bit different background than you others. In the beginning of my career, I wanted to cure my patients. I think it amused me afterwards. During last 30 years, I have noticed how huge blessing the studies, experiential learning and contemplation has been for me. In the beginning, I did not realize how traumatized I actually myself was. I save you from the details, but my life used to be quite a colorful drama, a soap opera, a life which is quite typical for people with complex trauma, and it culminated into cancer. My hypnotherapy studies about 15 years ago during the most difficult years of my life were an important turning point. I noticed that I can use contemplative ego state journaling as a method for self-realizing and healing. The deep meditative flow state can help you to find the way to your unconscious material. I found the strength of my own imagination. During those years, I moved from busy Helsinki to eastern border of Finland in the middle of the wilderness. And still here I am. The journaling has been my most important meditative practice, and the nature has been my church during my personal path. They have helped me to recognize the fullness and deepness of the human life. Of course, I have had many great mentors. Everybody needs somebody's support for healing. I afterward became aware that my personal journaling process resembled somehow John Bunyan's Christian allegory of Pilgrim's Progress. So my strong belief is that one can use contemplative journaling for self-analysis and healing. I began in the year of 2015 my sensory motor psychotherapy studies, and then the years during and after it started another transformative period of my life. In James Hillman's words, I found my soul's code. As I grow up to be mighty old birds, I still need mentors and spiritual practice to strengthen my connection to the earth. I think globally trauma awareness is so important. I think that most of the global health, ecological and social problems have somehow their roots in the trauma phenomena. We have to be able to heal collectively. As the world-famous physician and trauma advocate Gabor Mate says, no society can understand itself without looking at its shadow side. We who have had privilege to live safe childhoods or have had support for our recovery have a responsibility to support others, more disadvantaged groups on their healing path. So at the moment, this topic trauma is important for me because I think it is a question about the future of the humankind and the earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kati. So we'll now have our first question, which I'll address to all of our panelists today. We'd love to hear if you could help give us an underlying understanding of how you see individual and collective trauma manifested in your specific sphere of work. And this could be interpersonal, intercommunal, institutional, or national. And we'll start with Colette. If you could share with us about where you see trauma and its effect, especially on the individual.
Sure. And when I talk a little bit about its effect on the individual, I'm going to talk about it in very general terms and not get into real specific details, but just more in a conversational way to kind of have a understanding of how trauma impacts the individual. But before I say that, I do want to say, since others have been so open and talk about truth, I do want to say that also my comments are coming not just from the work that I've been doing, studying trauma, but also just from personal experiences. Because like Cherie and Corey, I did come from a background where I experienced violence as a child. Police came to our home. I think they had us on speed dial to get there quickly to intervene time after time. And also that was compounded by working, as you said earlier on the introductions, almost 20 years of working in war and violent affected countries. So when I talk about this and how it is impacting the nervous system, I have that lived experience and that felt experience. And that's what led me to learn more about trauma. As a matter of really personal survival. And then also I became a somatic experiencing practitioner about 3 years ago, and now work with others who are experiencing the impact of trauma. So I think, first of all, it's super important to acknowledge that stress and trauma are a fact of life, and it's really important to normalize it, and that it can have a neurobiological underpinning as much as other health and other issues like the flu or broken leg. So from a neurobiological standpoint, it can, traumatic stress can really range from a whole number of things, from surgical procedures on one hand to a car accident, natural disasters, but also it can be from even hearing stories or witnessing trauma or seeing it play out. The brain doesn't distinguish between what you might be witnessing or hearing because as my friend Mike would always say, its goal is to keep you alive, and that's the imperative. So it's not really concerned other than doing that. So it can also occur when working or being around what can be termed as toxic environments where stereotyping or belittling, bullying, dehumanization, injustices occur. So I think what's really important is for all of us as individuals to realize it's normal, it's common, part of life for our bodies to react to stressors, and we're wired to adjust and to work with that. But many times trauma does not resolve, and sometimes our systems get overwhelmed, get dysregulated, and can become really hyper aware or sensitive to perceived or actual threats. So just a couple more things I wanted to talk about is that also trauma is not necessarily in the event. Somebody could say, wow, that was a big bad event. There must have been trauma that was incurred. Not always. And somebody could say, well, that wasn't a big deal. How could they have had a traumatic event? Well, someone could, because it really depends upon the individual. It depends upon their makeup, their genetic history, their own life history of what they experienced in their life, what their family did, and also what kind of support and care and relationships they may have had that could have been helpful, or in other situations, maybe not helpful to them. And also trauma can be acute, it can be transitory, it can be short-lived, it can be chronic. And when this happens, we see all sorts of impacts. It could be our physical health, it could be our body, our well-being, our cognitive processes, our emotions, and our behaviors. And it absolutely can have an impact on our relationships. So sometimes when we think of stress and trauma as being rooted in and affecting our brain and mental processes, that's true, but also it affects our systems as a whole and can permeate many different things that we're doing in our lives.
Thank you, Colette. Corey, if you'd like to jump in here, we'd love to hear from you.
Yes, definitely. Let me just briefly say that trauma for me, I want to be very careful to say this because it might shock you. Trauma is necessary. And I think that we all have gotten to a place where, especially those of us that study trauma, that we're looking for something that is a bad thing. I don't think that trauma is a bad thing. Without trauma, we wouldn't have the Civil War in the United States. Without trauma, there wouldn't be a discussion around the Holocaust. Without trauma, there wouldn't be a discussion around what happens in many African countries with what would be seen as those who are corrupt. Trauma is important. Trauma is part of life. And I think that for any of the theorists, ethicists, or practitioners on the line, we all need to accept and acknowledge that trauma exists as part of life. I like what Mike said, because trauma is truth. When we don't hide from trauma, we can come out of the closet with our secrets. We can walk into freedom with the things that seem to have us bound, and we can cut ourselves loose to run free, knowing that we've lived through a real world experience, a real life experience that is specific to an individual. And as my sister Colette just said, it's even more interesting that our individual ways of understanding and articulating our trauma, it's so different, where twins can grow up in the same house. You see one that has an alcohol problem, and you say, why do you drink so much? And he says, well, I grew up with an alcoholic. And then you see the other twin walking with a book bag, and he's on his way from work. And he says, well, why are you drinking so much? No, why don't you drink alcohol? Because I grew up with an alcoholic. So trauma is necessary. Trauma is important. And trauma also allows for us to ensure that we have an experience to grow from and grow through, so that someone else can grow and be healed. I think that that is a necessary component. And trauma for the individual is part of life. And I think we can have a lot of opportunity there to work together to help others see trauma, so that we don't become traumatized by just living.
Thank you, Corey. Next, we'd love to hear from Cherie. And if you could speak more to your experience or your observation of collective trauma, we'd love to hear how you see that playing out, whether it's at a community or institutional level. And we'd love to hear more of your insights on that.
Okay, so my work is about examining intragroup discourses to see how they can help groups and organizations identify, name, and heal the harm caused by racial dominance, trauma, and oppression for the purpose of strengthening social justice efforts. And so I draw attention to the role of discourse. And so what I mean by discourse is dialogue, it's communication, it's conversation, it's language, talking, speaking, writing. It's the ways we talk about what we talk about. And it has a never-ending contribution to the various forms of racial dominance. And so, as I said earlier, I've researched workplace discourses between social workers, and that's where my work is now, is looking at how professionals talk about race, and for the purpose of being able to create cultures where conversations about race are normalized and generative. And so in my research experiences, and I'm going to share just a touch of my research, and this is directly from social workers' mouths. So in my research, experiences of Black, white, and biracial social workers mirrored my own encounters and perhaps reflect some of your own stories. So for example, Dawn, a white social worker in a leadership position in her organization, shared her career progress that came at the expense of her more qualified Black employees. Dawn says, I kept moving up. Every single one of my staff was Black and I was white.
Sheree, I think your video and audio may have frozen again. Hopefully you'll be back with us in just a few moments. Okay,
So
I think
am I back?
Yes.
I'm sorry about that. So I don't know what was missed there. I'll keep going so that I don't lose time. So then we're going to move on to Rachel, another white social worker who was describing her own discomfort around the topic of race. Rachel says, if you bring it up, other people will get uncomfortable. So when they're uncomfortable, you're uncomfortable. Everyone's uncomfortable, so you just change the subject, right? So this is how it operates in the workplace. Or at least a Black clinical social worker and a university administrator said, as she noted her own angst and need to protect her own personal agency. She says, these conversations are not very comfortable to have, and no one wants to be dismissed, minimized. You don't want to judge people in terms of your clinical view. So I draw attention to how these individual stories collide with each other to create the larger collective story of racialized dominance and oppression, of stress and trauma, of indignity, of silence and exclusion. And these experiences and their familiar themes are being re-experienced.
Sheree, I think we lost you again for a minute there. It wouldn't be an event in Zoom world in 2020 or 2021 without a few tech issues though. So it may be something with their platform. While we're waiting, I just want to take this moment to remind everyone to feel free to bring any questions that you might have to the chat. We'll be having a few moments at the end for a Q&A. So if you have questions, we'd love to be hearing from you as we're hearing from our panelists. And also at the end, after this webinar, we'll be having an optional connect and reflect open Zoom call. So if you'd like to join an open Zoom call, we're trying to get as close as we can to post-event social hour. So we'll be having an open Zoom call after this, and we'll put the link for that in the chat. So if anyone wants to come and hang out, introduce yourself, and hear a little bit more about MHCR and the people who are involved in this work, we'd love to connect with you there. I think Sheree is back on with us now. Sheree, we just did a short announcement break. So we had we're back over to you now.
Okay, so I apologize for this. I hope I've done something that I hope will resolve this. We'll see. And I'll quickly end this by saying I draw your attention to how these individual stories collide with each other to create the larger collective story of racialized dominance, oppression, of stress and trauma, of indignity, silence, and exclusion. And these experiences and their familiar themes are being re-experienced every day in workplaces and virtual spaces. They're happening in team, leadership, and board meetings, consultations, teaching, preaching, lecturing, counseling. They live and breathe in policies, reports, and progress notes, marketing ads, assessments, emails, and presentations. And so we must move away from the binary notion that racism harms only non-white bodies, right? And that white people are not harmed by this. And the privilege that it offers for whites is only gain for whites. There's harm too, and that harm is what continues to contribute to the racial harm that we are all experiencing. However, there is noticeable difference in the type of harm and how that harm has impacted. So any thought, behavior, ideology, a value that dehumanizes victims simultaneously dehumanizes dehumanizes the perpetrators, and when it remains unhealed, it wreaks havoc on us all. So our history of racial violence is a collective, generational, two-edged process that claims our humanity and holds each of us hostage. The result is a culture that is grounded in racialized historical and generational trauma. Thank you.
Thank you, Cherie. We'd also like to hear from Mike. When we're thinking about collective trauma, I know some of your work has touched on this at a national level, and from some of your peace building work in the Middle East and in other places, would love to hear how you see this manifested in your sphere of work.
It's a really complicated topic to work with any individual who's experienced trauma to move from a state of recognition and integration to responsibility. So we have a lot of conversations in the US and around the world right now about, you know, it's not my responsibility to educate my victimizer. It's not my responsibility to deal with my trauma. It's the responsibility of systems and structures around me. And that balance between responsibility to heal the self and to understand what the self has been through, yet to also keep systems and structures accountable to prevent the perpetration of trauma is a very complicated balance, because there is not a good model for the therapist, scientist, activist yet in our world. We don't have structures to support those types of individuals. But fundamentally, the effects of trauma, whether it's on they manifest on the level of the individual, interpersonal interactions, and intergroup reactions. And the specific manifestations that we see, all the way from things like changes in heart rate variability, alterations in threat perception, threat reactivity, lack of trust in the self, in my own body, in people around me, in structures and systems around me, avoidance of trauma reminders, changes in empathic processing and theory of mind networks in the brain. These things have dramatic implications on the collective experience of post-trauma, right? And I've fallen in love with the work lately of a 9th century scholar, Abu Zaid al-Balkhi, who was writing from Uzbekistan, who has these wonderful descriptions of anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder, which line up 95% with the DSM diagnostic frameworks for these things, but he was writing 1,000 years ago. And we see these things have over time been visible across cultures, across histories, that trauma takes you away from the self that you were, and fundamentally is a disempowering, de-agentic process. And this is about fundamentally restoring that agentic connection between, I do not control the narrative of what happened to me, but I have not only an ability, but a responsibility to change how I want to live in that narrative moving forward, because we have a fundamental ability for plasticity, for post-traumatic growth, and for dealing really, really acutely and overcoming some of the specific neurobiological effects of trauma and their symptoms. So in an entire society, we're talking about when trauma goes unaddressed, unheard, unexplored, unhealed, this is what becomes a cultural narrative that leads to cycles of competitive victimhood, as we see day in and day out between Kurdish, Sunni, Shia, Jewish, Christian Arabs, all throughout living in Jordan for the past 10 years of my life. These untreated And unrecognized and unhealed wounds fundamentally lead to cycles of competitive victimhood that solidify intra-group norms and reify cycles of conflict and competition that are going to keep leading this region and many parts of the world down cycles where reconciliation is near impossible. So to address trauma is fundamentally to instigate the peace-building process between individual cells in my body, and then between individuals in my community, and then in societies writ large.
Thank you so much for sharing that reflection on how we see this within societies and over the passage of time. And I think that's leads well into what we'll hear from Kathy next, as she'll be speaking to us or sharing a little bit about her perspective on understanding trauma at a national level. And so Kathy, would you like to share with us more about your work in Finland and
Yes.
how you all have been working there?
Yes, I will share a couple of slides. I can't speak without slides about this subject. Okay. Let's see. So I think the first stepping stone to recovery of toxic stress and to become healing orientated is to be able to see our shadows. Toxic individualism is one of the consequences of collective trauma, and it is a consequence of broken relationships. This kind of vicious circle is a closed and quite unstable system. It accumulates unexpressed emotions like intergenerational rates. But in this picture, I have visualized some of our ideas about systemic cultural healing. We need trauma awareness and inclusive support for families, children, and communities to break intergenerational trauma, which is quite a big problem here too. Like Finnish, there is a lot of domestic violence in Finland and substance abuse. A change can start from many points of the circle. This circle's energy force is channeling the unexpressed emotions energy in healthy communal activism for creating safer communities. In the process, we need a lot of trust and compassion. It is an open system of integration, and it is much more stable in crisis than a closed system. I think that we are at the moment in Finland still in a closed vicious circle of toxic stress. Here is this toxic vicious circle. You can have later the pictures if you want and see them. I have to go pretty fast. So here is our model, which we have created here. It is our professional team's trauma-informed model, which we call the common language. In our model, in the middle, we have compassion, and we think that the wisdom in this model can be customized for every people working in human services. Still, the idea is that every organization should build their own inclusive model of trauma-informed program in their own self-organizing process. Already in the beginning of our team's journey, we found the Scotland's model very interesting. They have 4 levels of education for professionals working in the human services. The basic knowledge, the first level knowledge and skills are for everybody, on the 4th level are the trauma and other systems experts. We can see in the Scotland's models a typical thing in almost all the trauma-informed models, which is that they often borrow ideas, experiential wisdom from other models. Like in this model, 4 R's in gray circle are borrowed from Substance and Mental Health Services Administration's model. So I think it is not just a question about evidence-based methods, but also modeling experiential wisdom. Here is SAMHSA's model, which Scotland has borrowed, and we have borrowed it too in our model. You can see the light green leaves. There are SAMHSA's model 4Rs. And at the moment, we are building a Trauma Summit Finland summit. Trauma Summit Finland, and it's an open web summit for all Finnish citizens. We think that trauma and adverse childhood experiences are everybody's business, and we have their trauma experts and trauma survivors. And this is very interesting project. So my important message is that I think that trauma should be taught to everybody already in schools. What's toxic stress and how people react to it. And we have noticed that it's not very complicated. People can understand this very easily. Thank you.
Thank you, Kati. And I think what you just shared there and highlighting some of the practical ways that governments or institutions can help their communities become more trauma informed is a perfect segue into our next question, which is thinking about how can our institutions, how can our communities or our governments become more trauma aware or trauma informed in what they do? I think all of your work in various ways touches on really practical ways that we could start to envision this. And I imagine many of our audience members today are working on a lot of different processes and programs that are maybe seeking to increase trauma awareness in this time. And perhaps we could all benefit from hearing perhaps lessons learned or examples of where increasing trauma awareness has gone really well and what's led into that being done effectively, and perhaps where it's gone terribly wrong or where it's could have been done much better. So maybe Corey, can we hear from you first? I know a lot of your work has touched on the importance of community-based research and needs assessment and looking at how to co-create solutions with communities from a strength-based model. Could you share a little bit more of your experience and any other practical input that you would have? And also just before you start, and I'll note this for all of our speakers, if you could keep your comments between 2 and 3 minutes for this last question. That's a little shorter than we had originally planned, but we just want to make sure we have some time for questions at the end.
Totally. Thank you again for an opportunity. I'm having a great time chatting and answering some of these great questions. I think Mike is jumping in on some of them. We're having a great conversation online. So if you're looking at the chat or not, please jump in. A lot of good information there. I'll be quick. I think that the essence of community integration of trauma, healing, and reconciliation really has to go back to the word community. It has to be the community defining what it is that they're seeking and how they define either reconciliation, healing, and or some form of really coming together. And I think that I'm working on my own theory there. I'll talk about that later if I have a chance. But I think that the answer here really has to go back to how do communities understand what their underlying ethic is? Ethic being how do I live the best life, the happy life, the life where I can avoid the things that would cause our community disruption. And in order to really get to that, I think that I have to compare and contrast the Roman culture, the US culture. In Rome, they had a in Rome, they had an honor shame culture, which puts whole groups of people out of the community and then leaves no room for hope and healing to come back. In America, we have a guilt shame culture, or a guilt innocence culture. And the biggest issue there is in the church and in many different communities, we have sub-pockets, especially in minority communities, where the culture then starts to overlay one another. And very quickly, thank you, Hannah, we get to a place where we have not only guilt and innocence, but then we have honor and shame. So where do I fit in? I don't know. I can't be myself. I get put out. I have no more love. I have no more place. And then the society has no room for me because I'm guilty and I never really repay back the thing that I've been found guilty of. So I have no space, no place, except to be a disruptor.
Thank you, Corey. Next, I'd love to hear from Cherie. I know a lot of your work has looked at developing and implementing anti-racism frameworks in both educational institutions, as I believe, as well as academic, and looking at how and where this is done well or where some common pitfalls might be. So I don't know if you would want to speak to that or anything else that has been inspired by this conversation so far.
So this is a big question, but I'm really going to try to narrow it down. I think where I want to start is that we first have to be able to create communities like Corey was just talking about, and include safety, belonging, and dignity, right? These are three things that are inherent to each of us, right? We all come into the world with those. When we come and try to do work that is structured out of white supremacy, we can't do that, right? Because we can't, the master's tools will not reconstruct the master's house, right? So we have to find something different. Another thing that Mike has spoken about is truth. I mean, we have to be able to tell the truth. And if we go back to the origins of the United States, it started on denial. And Ibram Kendi talks about denial as being a primary element in the US and as it relates to racism. And so in order for us to tell the truth, though, we have to have a healed body, a healed mind, or at least have some skills to navigate all the complexity that comes with telling the truth. And Mike, I love what you said about truth. And I could not agree more. And so, you know, for me, it's about going into organizations and honestly talking about trauma and honestly being able to point out how trauma is impacting all of us. When we can understand how we have been impacted by trauma, how we have been restricted and limited, and our imaginations have been shrunk, our bodies have been shrunk, have been constricted by trauma, when we can see the benefit for ourselves, when we can see the benefit for our communities, then there's that buy-in. When I can see that there's possibility for me, possibility for my children, my grandchildren, and my great-great-grandchildren, then that possibility it gives me something to anchor onto. So we have to be able to anchor onto into something that will allow us to navigate the disequilibrium that happens when we start telling the truth. Right? I know I've said a whole lot of different things there, but I just am bringing those all together and put it out there. We got to tell the truth. We have to be able to heal. It has to include safety, belonging, and dignity. And we have to address that denial along with telling the truth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cherie. And as you were talking about truth telling, I thought that the way that truth telling happens and the way that these processes can be structured has looked so differently in so many different contexts. And I wonder, Colette, if you could actually speak in your comments more to where you also have seen truth telling and peace building processes happening, and where does trauma healing or a trauma-informed approach come in from your experiences in some of these processes?
Yeah, no, I think for any one of us who've been involved in peace building or dialogue processes, it's really incumbent upon us to become aware, to integrate to the extent that's possible, the knowledge of trauma and take a trauma-informed approach, to partner and seek out the knowledge of those that we're working with. And something that both Corey and Cherie mentioned, it is absolutely important that that be based upon people that we're working with in a program, and that it comes from what their knowledge and their experiences in their context. That is absolutely what should be guiding all programming, not something that people from the outside may try to import or think's important. It has to come from the community and the individuals involved. And then to the extent possible, but again, this is very contextual, and it's based upon whether this is a permissive environment, there's safety and all the things that Cherie mentioned, to the extent that there could be an aspect of individual and relational healing practices integrated in a way, again, that's co-created with those folks that are involved and directly part of it, but also our own, because when we as outsiders come into a space, we are bringing our experiences, whatever we are bringing into the room, and our own trauma history, and that can also impact things. We have to be really aware of that, and we have to, take care of our own baggage, so to speak, and what we're bringing in, and knowing that that's very important because we're all affected in different ways. And then the second part, I want to talk about truth telling specifically, because oftentimes truth telling involves taking testimony or conducting interviews. And as a former prosecutor many, many years ago, I completely understand the concept of calling witnesses to provide testimony or interviews that are done through research. At the same time, I've experienced situations where while the witness testimony that's being done through research or in a tribunal or a commission room, maybe supporting the case or building the archives of the truth, which one could say is very important, it does not always support the health or the well-being of the witness. And so in truth-telling processes, such as truth commissions, it's so important to be sure that the effect of retelling the traumatic incident or narrative can have an impact on the individual and their nervous system. So that is very important to be aware of that. So it's important to take into consideration if, when, and how such testimony is taken. There are many different ways that things can be done, and it has to have the individual, their agency, and their well-being at the front and center, and has to honor and uplift that agency and safety and security of that individual. So, in conclusion, if testimony is provided or taken, it has to be done in a way that doesn't re-traumatize that person and at the expense of the truth-telling process. Or no, their expense when we're trying to do the truth-telling process.
Thanks so much, Colette. I'm wondering if, from Mike, if we could hear from more of your experiences and perhaps lessons learned in specific cases or in research that you've done regarding where trauma healing work has gone well in certain processes, or perhaps where it has failed. Would love to hear more of your thoughts and reflections on this conversation.
Yeah, I'm going to take three really, really quick snapshots at an individual level and then at a research and policy level. One of my close friends and former clients, he came as an asylum seeker to Jordan using a false ID, because if he was to use his ID, he would be sent to a special military camp. His wife and child were not in that camp. So he came using a false premise. His trauma is directly tied to military service. So at the same time, he can never share that story with a therapist because he would risk having the non-refoulement clauses violated and potentially getting deported. At the same time, the nature of his trauma is sexual in nature. And as an adult man in the Arab world, you do not talk about that shit. You keep a tight lid on that. So at the same time, the truth, him telling the truth is something he can barely admit to himself, and actually has legal ramifications if he was ever to tell it in a formal or informal context with another soul on this planet. So the first step is being able to at least have a conversation with yourself of respecting the truth of what happened to you. And then second, being able to accept the truth that that has effects. Because for so many people who live in high stigma contexts where mental health is simply something to be brushed off and be brushed away with simply being strong or having grit, it takes a lot of psychoeducational work to get someone, especially an adult brown man in certain parts of the world, to admit that my body, my behavior, my interaction with the world is different because of what happened to me. And to get someone to admit that truth is the first step to then being able to get someone to admit the truth and possibility of recovery. So the process of admission and truth-telling is first and foremost something deeply individual, but moving that into a collective or putting that into the atmosphere can have serious security ramifications for individuals in certain contexts. So it's not as simple as collective truth-telling is always a good or therapeutic or helpful thing. From there, we've actually seen really mixed data from cases like South Africa and Rwanda, where because there was limited post-truth-telling care to survivors who were involved in truth commissions, PTSD symptoms often got much worse over the long haul. So simply the act of truth-telling as being restorative, that moves us deeply away from everything we know clinically and therapeutically to be true, because that needs to be a very personal and curated an important process where the individual is defining the terms upon which they tell their truth and to who. And us making sure that all we're doing is when that person is ready, that we have the care systems in place, which in no country in the world do we have at this point, to be able to respect that choice to tell my truth in the context that I want, to who I want. And especially in cases where there is impunity and justice, which is therapeutic, is not a guarantee on the other end of that. That's potentially a recipe for disaster. So right now we're working, with Beyond Conflict and others to try to create more data to actually show in contexts where individual trauma healing and collective healing was the basis of peace building efforts, does that work, whether or not it was public, fundamentally lead to positive changes in social stability, in social cohesion, and in peace building outcomes in the long term? Because we have almost no data and long-term RCT data on that type of stuff. So we're actually trying to change the way we collect data to say that if you heal the individual, if you focus on the whole person and their well-being and health, can we transform how we build peace, how we reconcile, and the long-term trajectories of conflict? And that's still an unanswered question in the data that we do hope to be able to answer soon.
Thanks, Mike. And what an important question for us all to think about as we're working at these important intersections. Well, we've come to the end of our planned questions, and now we want to give an opportunity to hear some of the questions that have come up from our audience today. So, Cam, could you let us know what some of those questions are and bring some of the questions to our panelists today?
Yep. Hey guys, I'm Cam, the communications officer here at MHCR, and so we got a whole bunch of good questions. It's just we're on the time limit, so we have a couple that we want to ask you guys. So the first question is, so since the work is so delicate and everything, with you guys being mediators and facilitators, practitioners, how do you feel like you can ease the process for those who have been traumatized so they can share the trauma without being re-traumatized? How do we best help others to receive other stories of trauma? And we could open that up to the panel. I think about 2 to 3 minutes.
I'll start. I'll quickly say, for me, this is Corey. For me, it's been really eye-opening to go into communities where people have real deep-seated anger, frustration, pain. They've been forgotten. They've been left out. They need jobs. And I'm talking white, black, purple, green. It doesn't matter what race. The issue that has often come up is, how do we deal with what we're feeling? And it's really a matter of allowing for them to speak openly about what they feel and renegotiating with their emotions what feeling they keep cycling through. Because sometimes we keep reminding ourselves that the feeling we have is the right feeling based on what we've experienced, when sometimes it's about how we've seen the situation we're in. So for many, it was a community garden. So we don't have to go ask somebody else for food. For some, it was a community co-op of sharing funds. It was different resources so that we didn't have to go ask the people that we felt forgot us for anything. It was simply just renegotiating with themselves what the answers were within their internal self and their community. And I think that traumatizing, again, is a matter of personal reflection and how one sees the situation, but it's definitely important to talk about, and it's definitely important to give them a space to feel like they can kind of dump what they're going through and work through their issues and not be left alone in them.
Did anybody else want to respond to that question? Or okay. So the next question that we got from the crowd was, can we heal collective trauma through individual participation, healing, or does it require community healing? And that's open to the panel.
Can you repeat that, Cameron? You were on mute.
Yep. Can we heal collective trauma through individual participation and healing, or does it require community healing?
I'm going to put on my neuroscience hat for a second here. You know, in the data that we've seen, when you take individuals who have not necessarily meet clinical thresholds of PTSD, but you have individuals who have clear trauma exposure and subsequent trauma-related symptoms, and you put them in a brain scanner and watch what happens to empathy, for example. It doesn't divide equally among all people. We can't say that trauma makes people more or less empathic, more or less willing to reconcile across lines of conflict. So much of this depends on, does the perpetrator look like me? Are they my in-group? Are they an out-group? There's so many dynamics that make each individual context and conflict unique that it's hard to know in what context the balance of collective versus individual is feasible, safe, wanted, and useful. And these are highly localized processes that really have to be left up to indigenous practices in those communities, individual health and behavioral outcomes, and individual conflict outcomes, because I can't force right now in 10 years of conflict Syria, an Alawite general to sit down with a Sunni recruit who was formerly with the FSA and say, y'all need to reconcile and that's how we're going to heal trauma. That is not up to me. That is not up to, that's up to the timeline and trajectory of that conflict and the unique behavioral and social goals of that community in that moment.
And did anybody else want to respond to that, or we can move on to the last question? Okay, and the last question is, how do we regain the value of truth in a world of so much information and so much misinformation? Anybody can jump in for that one.
But just so we don't have silence, I'll jump in and say something. I think that the biggest problem is how we define things. And that's what we've really been talking about. Individual levels of definition, what Mike was describing, they start at the individual level, which means they're internal. They are collective, meaning that they are also time-centered and really located in time because they're passed down from our parents, our relatives, our experiences. Two people could be in the same place and see two and hear two different things. So how we define things really matters in a sense of how we come to agree upon what we're defining. And that's really the biggest issue with trauma, is when you ask people to define trauma, they give you different definitions. So I think that there has to be some understanding of, is there and I'm about to go to Immanuel Kant here, is there a categorical imperative, meaning that it stands for all, or is there a hypothetical imperative, meaning that we add all of these other variables into our definition that have nothing to do with the general definition that meets all underneath that definition. So for instance, I'll just start with truth. Categorically, truth is truth, meaning that if I start saying, well, if I tell the truth, then I'm going to lose my relationship or I'm going to lose my job, then that is now a hypothetical imperative, and we start to pick those up to kind of meet our needs. Categorically, we should always tell the truth. So I think that there is a lot of misinformation, but we need to really define what is healthy for society, which leads to a whole nother situation of how you define healthy. So I'll leave that to Mike and Colette, and then I'm going to mute.
So I want to just touch on something really quick and then hear from other folks. But when I hear the question, I think the question was about regaining the value of truth. And excuse me, and with that question comes a presupposition that truth was there in the first place, right? And so then when we go back to how Mike has unpacked truth and how complex and complicated it is, that gets to be a very tough thing. So, I just want to posit that question has a presupposition for which, at least in my context, in the national context of the US, when we go to the foundings and origins of the country, it was grounded in untruth. It was grounded in lies, right? And so from there, how do we assume that truth is valued? Right, with all the denial that continues to occur, there's something about being able to turn away, willfully avoid, to be blind to, that allows for our our remaining alive and so-called functioning. So I just want to throw that out there, and then I would love to hear from others.
I'll briefly just mention here that, back at that question, how do we regain the value of truth in a world of so much information and misinformation? There was a Syrian activist, Mazen Hamada, who literally traveled all around Europe and the United States on the dime of various governments to tell his truth about the experience of torture in Syria. He ended up deciding to go back to Syria a couple of days ago, and there was a big New York Times article about his disappearance. Aylan Kurdi, 4-year-old boy, washed up dead, and there's photographic evidence on the beaches of Turkey trying to get to Europe for a better life. The reality is that most people don't give a shit about the truth of brown and black bodies around the world. And it hasn't mattered for centuries. So there is very little incentive, especially in contexts where the powers that be are of a different class, race, origin, somehow different than you or I, that my truth will not matter beyond me being the dance monkey for a temporary government to advance political needs. And that is the day in and day out of every refugee that I work with. You want me to speak at a conference? Okay, you want me to make your audience sob so they pay attention a bit more, that my lived experience is all that matters, but you're not going to do a damn thing about actually giving me any treatment that I need. So truth has not mattered when it comes to brown and black truth for centuries. So at the same time, how do we expect there to be any value in truth when the populations that have most heavily experienced trauma have had no incentive and in terms of tangible justice outcomes for saying it, for sharing it? I know that's pessimistic, but that's the reality that I'm living in with a lot of folks in this part of the world.
We have time for just 1 or 2 more comments if anyone on the panel would still like to add any closing thoughts or responses to any of these questions. I wish we could stay on for many more hours and continue these conversations that have gotten started.
Well, Annalise, I just wanted to note, since I do have to jump, I wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity not only to be here, but also just to bring up, I use certain terms on purpose. The idea of necessary and unnecessary as a matter of defining, first of all, trauma is always going to be a part of our lives. So necessary in the sense that if we don't define trauma as existing, we miss an opportunity for people to talk about their trauma, because then they feel like they're alone and they are going through something without any support. The rawness that Mike speaks to is a rawness that I could speak to, that many on this panel could speak to. My model, looking at the historical trauma and its influence from on African-American males and females in Baltimore and around the world, as I've shared that model and people have called me, they've discovered that no matter where we are, there are policies that are rooted in people trying to push people and move people to act in a certain manner. So I thought it very important just to say that I use very certain terms for a reason, so that we can all question and ask ourselves, why do we run from and shy from the things that are always going to be here, such as racism, discrimination, pain, trauma, discomfort, and seeking pleasure in most of the people's lives without dealing with the real things that we're dealing with. So thank you, peace. Thank you all. I look forward to working with you and talking to you soon.
Thank you, Corey, and thank you all for engaging in this really rich conversation today. We have just a few announcements before we close with a grounding practice that Colette's going to lead us through. So I'm going to hand it back over to Cam for his announcements, and then Hannah has a brief announcement, and then Colette. So just feel free to follow each other. And Cam, I think you're on mute.
Okay, guys, can you see my screen right now?
Yes.
Okay. So somebody asked about some concise resources in regards to trauma and everything. So we actually do have a couple resources that you guys can use. So one is the Think Peace podcast that was actually created by Colette and myself, host, and it talks about the intersection between neuroscience and peace building, and there's a lot of talks about trauma and everything. And we actually just released an episode today with Mike Ninkachuk, who talked about trauma and its relationship with violence, and what causes that and everything. So that's on all podcasting platforms. You can also check that out at thinkpeacepodcast.com. And yeah, and if you're looking for resources in regards to this work and everything, and just hearing some really good conversation about this work, you should check out the Think Peace podcast. And our second resource is another one, which was, so this is Neuro Peace. This is it's an online open source series that's going to focus on the intersection of neuroscience and peace building as well. This was edited by Colette, and the first volume was actually released recently, and it was written by Doug Fields, Lasana Harris, and Mike Ninkachuk also. And it's about individual aggression and everything, and that was just released as well. So if you guys are looking for resources to get more about this work and everything, you can check those out. And the website for that is neuropeace.org, if you guys want to check that out.
Thank you so much, Cam. And so I just wanted to introduce that we're having a Connect and Reflect session with MHCR team following this call. So if anybody wants to stay on so you have a chance to dive more deeply into this topic, we can talk about it until about 6 p.m. I'm going to be putting the link in the chat. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us for such a rich conversation. And now I'll pass it over to Colette for our closing.
Thank you, Hannah. Okay, so I don't know, I've got to see if you can see me. I may have to step back a little bit. Okay, so I just invite everyone who would like to participate in this exercise to take one of your hands, whichever hand you prefer, and to put it straight out in front of you with your palm up. And you can do this now with your eyes closed or open, however you wish. I'm going to do it with my eyes closed. And now with your eyes opened or closed, however you wish, think about or visualize in your mind's eye that you are giving the most wonderful, joyful thing you can think of to somebody that you care a lot about and love. Just take a moment to have that come into your brain, or however you visualize, wherever that might come from. The most wonderful, joyful thing you can think of to someone you love. Let's just stay with that for just about 10 seconds. And then hold that image or thought. And now take your hand and put it on your heart. And hold it there. And then just notice whatever it is you notice. It may be just your hand on your heart. You may feel warmth. You may be noticing softening in the area around your heart. Whatever you notice, just be curious. And then when you feel like it, you can move your hand wherever, your lap or to your side. And just a reminder that as a lot of us are out in the world, whether you're supporting family during this time, especially with COVID and all the challenges, or you're supporting friends, or you're working in different ways to get through your day with work or all the things that you're doing, it's just a little bit of a reminder that whatever you're giving out into the world and to others, that you're bringing back to yourself too, and taking care of yourself. So thank you.
Thank you, Colette, for helping us to close our discussion with such a wonderful practice. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their Wednesday. And I look forward to engaging hopefully with a lot of you in the future, and hopefully with some of you in a few minutes as we jump onto our social hour or social half hour in our Connect and Reflect time. So thank you all for participating today, and we'll see you soon.